Everybody, welcome to episode 34. Can't believe that this is our 34th episode of Discussion with the Pros. Tonight we have the honor and privilege of hosting Callum O'Donnell from Aberlour, Rico with us tonight. Usually I have everybody mute to get started, but I'd like everybody to unmute for a second because I really want everybody to start off with a big thank you to Callum for these absolutely beautiful packages. So everybody, please say thank you.
Thank you. Outstanding. So
Beautiful.
cool.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I mean,
thank you.
Really,
Really
just
nice.
absolutely
Thank you.
gorgeous. I mean, Callum, I got to tell you, the number of people who are sending us messages complimenting these packages, and then the glass, the Glencairn that you sent us, and the stickers, and the information really was just wonderful. So, Eric, if you could do me a favor now and mute everybody except for you, me, and Callum. Let me know when we're done with that. Okay. All right. So, Callum, do me a favor. Tell us all where you are right now, and tell us a little bit about your role in your company, because Aberlour is owned by Pernod Ricard, right?
Yes, so Aberlour is owned by Pernod Ricard, and everybody that sent in a message or liked the kits, thank you so much. That's nothing to do with Pernod Ricard. That's actually our agency, Ayatana XP. If you have a wee look around the kit, on the front end of the kit, you'll actually see that's their logo there. They're a really fantastic experiential agency, and they've kind of guided us through the pandemic, I suppose. Now, with where am I based? I'm based in Chicago. I've been there for 2.5 years now. And my role in the company has changed drastically, I suppose, in the last sort of 6 years since I got this job. I started off as a graduate brand ambassador in the Dominican Republic in Santo Domingo there for 2 years. And then I did a year in San Francisco, and then I'm coming up for 3 years now in Chicago. The year in San Francisco was as a BA as well, and now I'm more of a brand specialist, which is very similar, but with a little bit more of a responsibility with regards to kind of events and sales and all that sort of stuff. I won't bore you with all that crap, but I'm really enjoying it. And now we've actually lost our other two brand ambassadors. One of them's gone part-time, and the other one's quit to start his own company. So it's just me that's left. I'm the only full-time guy that's kicking about. So you've got to deal with me, ladies and gentlemen. So if you don't like me, I'm sorry. Please email all your criticisms to my boss. But otherwise, hopefully I can do the job.
Well, actually, Callum, if I recall, you and I first met with Michael Nolan. Nolan was at the event too. Almost exactly 2 years ago, there was a special Aberlour event at Binny's in the catacombs, where you had the Abuna and the Abuna Alba, and we had with us that night. It was Lou Bryson, right? He was a special guest. That was a wonderful event. Remember that one, Michael? It was great. Now there we go. The bottle that he's holding up right now. That's great.
Yeah, so that was really special event. That was when we just launched the Alba. We just launched the Abuna Alba. And Lou Bryson, he came in. He actually did. I don't know if you guys got the books that night. I think you did. You got the red bespoke books that we had made. There's very few of those kicking about left, so hopefully you guys still read them on occasion. But Lou had signed one of the books, and then also we had Graham there as well, who's a pretty special guest himself. So we had the Master Distiller, Graham Cruikshank there. So it was a really cool event, really cool event. But yeah, I mean, Chicago's been really good to me. I absolutely love it. Everybody there is so nice. And I was just saying this on my previous.
Hold on, did we just lose him?
Yeah.
Hold on,
no,
Callum.
No, he's still connected.
Zoom's been acting weird all day.
Okay, hold on a second, Callum.
Hello.
Okay, hold on a second, Callum. So
Hey, there you're back.
You faded out there for a second. You're back now. So
Sorry, I don't know what happened, but my camera just turned off and no one could hear me. No, I was just saying that I absolutely love Chicago. And in the last tasting that I was in, someone was saying, I've mentioned how a lot of Chicagoans call it scotch, not scotch. And he was like, "Oh man, you're disparaging Chicago." And I was saying that I've moved city 7 times in the last 10 years, and Chicago's the place that I've stayed the longest.
It's a great city. I mean, I'm new to Chicago too, sort of. I'm from Philly originally, and people still joke around about how I pronounce certain words like water and museum and chocolate and all that stuff. So anyway, let's get to the lineup here. So what I'd like you to do is, as we start to drink the first expression, which is Aberlour 12, please tell us a little bit about Aberlour, the Aberlour distillery, the history, and Sláinte, everybody. Enjoy.
Sláinte, everybody. So, no, I think, obviously, I always like to talk, I don't know if anybody's a big whiskey reader, but there's a book called Whiskey by Aeneas MacDonald. It was written in the early 1900s. And he said that Aberlour, and this is even back then, it was the Aberlour was 23 years old at the time this book was written, but he said that Aberlour is the quintessential Speyside Scotch. And by that, he doesn't delve into that too much, but by that, I think what he means is that Speyside Scotches were renowned for being three things, and it came from the Glenlivet in 1824, well, before that, but legally in 1824, rich, floral, and fruity. All right. Now, one thing that I think you'll all know and you'll all learn is the more Scottish people you meet, Scottish people are so frugal. They're so tight that they can peel an orange in their pocket. Okay. That's my dad says that the reason that Irish whiskey has an E and Scotch doesn't is that the Scots didn't want to pay for the extra space on the label. Okay. Scottish people are renowned for being really, really frugal. Now, when you look at that, what does that actually mean in the sense of just Aberlour, Speyside, the Highlands, and then especially Islay and the west of Scotland whiskies? Johnny Walker, okay, which is probably the most well-known whiskey, most well-known Scotch whiskey around the world. It sold 20 million cases last year. Johnny Walker was from Kilmarnock, which is on the west coast of the United States. No, sorry, not in the United States. I'm from Scotland. I've been here for too long. So it's on the west coast of Scotland. Johnny Walker didn't really care too much about what kind of whiskey he was making. He just wanted to make good stuff. And so he went as close as he could for as cheaply as he could. So he went to the islands, right? So all of these whiskies on the west coast of Scotland, the northwest coast, you look at Oban as well, even though it's on the mainland, they were bringing in whiskies from the islands, okay? And that's where they got that lovely kind of salty smokiness to them, right? Then you look at John Dewar, okay, for example, in Perth, right? He's about an hour north of Edinburgh, right, in Perth, which is lovely, lovely place, all right? But they use very, very light and creamy whiskies in Dewars, okay, especially with Aberfeldy super close, and then the lowlands, right? Now, everybody in Speyside, now whether they were a blend or a single malt, if you look at the blends, let's talk about the Chivas brothers, okay? Chivas Regal have made some phenomenal whiskies, but none of them are smoky. Okay, you go to the Chivas 12, the Royal Salute, or the Chivas Regal Altus. They're all very rich, floral, and fruity, and that's because Speyside whiskies, ladies and gentlemen, they were going to the closest and cheapest ingredients that they could make the best product possible. All right. Now with Aberlour, that was no different. Aberlour is at the heart of what people call the heart of Scotch whiskey. The heart of Scotch whiskey being Speyside, and Aberlour is at the heart of that region. Okay, founded in 1879 by this guy called James Fleming, Aberlour immediately took on this role of using Oloroso sherry barrels. We can talk a lot more and we can go in a lot more depth about the Oloroso sherry, but I think the main thing that Aberlour has always wanted to do and always strived to do was to create a liquid that was easy drinking, okay, but at the same time had a complexity to it. And I think honestly, that would be something that I would say goes for the whole range, okay, that we're going to taste tonight. It is easy to drink. It is smooth. It is soft. It is gentle. But at the same time, it has a nuance to it. It does have a complexity that that you don't find, I think, in a lot of other whiskies, especially blends. But, in the higher-end single malts, they're few and far between. And one of the things that, 1997, we launched the Abuna. 2019, we launched the Abuna Alba. That was why I met you, Gil, and I met you, Mike. That was a kind of bridge away for us, and I think it's only added to those layers of Aberlour's complexity. So,
all right, so let me stop you there for a second. I want to make sure that I see how this all fits in here. So this is the 12, okay? This is the 12, and can tell a little bit about what is it actually aged in? Like what type? Tell us a little bit about the casks that they're aged in, please.
So essentially, when we talk about Aberlour 12, and we talk about any of the age statements at Aberlour, we're talking about two different types of barrel. Okay, Quercus Robur and Quercus Alba, or essentially Oloroso sherry, okay, so ex-European oak that's had Oloroso sherry previously in it, and then ex-bourbon, okay, which is your Quercus alba, white American oak, obviously land of the free, the home of the brave. Now, to come back to that point, Gil, a lot of whiskies now, in fact, the majority of Scotch whiskies especially, will do some kind of finish in another barrel. Now, for those of you that are a little bit unsure, finish is anywhere between 6 and 24 months, but usually it's between 12 and 18 months that the whiskey will spend up to a year and a half in a specific type of barrel to finish it. So, for example, it'll spend 11 years in a bourbon barrel, and then it'll spend a year and a half in a sherry barrel, and they'll call it a sherry finish whiskey. Okay. Aberlour doesn't do that. We don't do that at Aberlour. None of our whiskies are finished in any type of barrel. Aberlour, when the whiskey comes off when the spirit comes off the still, we will then separate the spirit out, and it will mature for 12, 16 years in ex-bourbon barrels, and the other proportion will mature for 12, 16, 18 years in the sherry barrel. After those periods of time, we will then marry the whiskies together. Now, one thing I think that a lot of people talk about, especially when the 12, not so much, but the 16 as we move on there, is balance. And that's given to us by the fact that we have this massive range of flavour that's afforded to us by maturing the whiskey in the barrel for that full length of time.
Okay, let me ask you another question then. Every year that you produce Aberlour 12, and am I pronouncing it correctly, Aberlour? Because a few people corrected me privately here before.
Aberlour rhymes with happy hour.
Aberlour happy hour, brilliant.
Yeah, I can tell you that. That's my favorite line. So.
I love that. And by the way, for those of you who are jumping ahead, I learned at the private tasting 2 years ago that it's Abuna because it's like Hakuna Matata, Abuna Matata. So that's how you remember what Abuna is supposed to sound like. So are you trying to make sure that the 12 is the same every year? So you're marrying the bourbon aged plus the sherry aged. You're marrying the casks together. Is the 12 supposed to be approximately the same every year?
Yes. So I think, with any sort of high-end whiskey or any whiskey that's sold in the thousands and thousands and thousands of cases, Aberlour sells about 350,000 cases a year, which is a lot for a single malt. Considering the biggest single malt is the Glenfiddich, which is 1.2 million, and I think Glenlivet's around there as well. Mm-hmm. So, we're 25-30% of that volume, so it's a lot. The hardest thing with whiskey, ladies and gentlemen, is to repeat consistency. Consistency is the hardest thing to attain, and you'll hear that across master blenders, master distillers, quality control, whatever it is. Consistency is the hardest thing to create. Now, does that mean that this Aberlour 12 is going to taste the same as the unopened bottle that you've had on the shelf for 15 years? No, but they use a control sample every year. And they match the whiskey to that, and that's how they would, every single batch. So week to week, our master blender is a guy called Sandy Hislop. He knows about 1,000 samples every week, and in there you'll have to combine the Aberlour, 12-year-old ex-bourbon with the Aberlour 12-year-old Oloroso to find this flavor that we've got here.
Right, and of course the 12. That means that's the minimum age that it can be, because there could be some things older in here.
Yeah, and generally there are older things in there. A Scotch hasn't quite reached that stage of Japanese whiskey yet, where we're having to just crank the price up of everything. Worrying about, oh God, we're going to run out of the 12-year-old. Like I said before, the Scots are the most frugal bastards you'll ever meet in your life. All right, we have been storing that whiskey since the dawn of time. So there's a lot of stock there, and Aberlour actually, if everyone wants to keep this on the DL, but Aberlour is actually renovating. We're adding some stills as well, preemptively, because I think the Aberlour boom, or the Aber boom, as some people are calling it in the industry, it's really hit us by storm, especially in the last couple of years.
Okay, so does this mean that we now have to delete that from the recording? I mean, are you just messing up with Eric now?
No. Eric doesn't need to delete it, but if anybody reaches out to me afterwards and like, "Hey man, I saw this on this recording," I'll just deny it.
Wow, you did a good American accent there. That was impressive. Okay.
I'll just say that you guys have deep faked me, and this is all a fake.
Yeah, we got skills. So the 16. Okay, so is the juice that goes into the 16? coming essentially from the same bottles and everything that are going into the 12? They're just older. Is it the same stuff, just older?
Great question. And I think this one comes up all the time. But the big thing with the 16 and the 12 and the 18, the age statements, double cask matured, yes. However, the proportion of what cask we put in there differs. And you'll immediately notice this, ladies and gentlemen, with the Aberlour 16. It has this lovely rounded balance to it that the 12 didn't quite have. The 12 has that sort of typical Scotch that's been in a bourbon barrel sharpness and spice on the front end, and you get a little bit of that kind of warm honey toasted oak in the back with the 12. But with the 16, guys, you're going to get this kind of, do you know what, I'm going to have some of it as well. I can't talk about it and not drink some of it.
I'm actually impressed you were able to go this far. That's very impressive.
So no, I mean, the 16, guys, has just got that lovely kind of chocolatey rounded edge to it. The dark fruit of the sherry barrel is going to come through a lot more on this one.
So this one has, you're saying that this has more of the sherry barrels than the bourbon barrels? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, that's not what I'm saying. It has a higher proportion of the sherry barrels compared to the 12. But whether it has more sherry barrels than ex-bourbon, that remains to be seen.
Okay, got it. So the balance is different. Okay, so they still both have sherry and the bourbon, but there's more of the sherry barrels in this. Got it. Understood in terms of the proportion. And talk to me a little bit about proof. Okay, so, as you've probably seen in the industry, I mean, you've been in the industry for years, we are seeing more and more higher proofed whiskeys. Okay, it seems, it's almost like proof inflation that's been happening over the years. And these two are both 40%. Okay, they're both, 80 proof, 40 ABV. Can you talk a little bit about proof in whiskey and why Aberlour is producing these at 40 ABV?
Perfect. So there's also another question in there that I'm going to answer, Eric. I'm going to get to you in a second. So yeah, there's been this proof inflation. Unfortunately, in whiskey, we don't have a Federal Reserve to pump money in, to pump water into the whiskies. You might say. No, just a quick political joke there, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully, I don't get fired for that one.
It's all good. It's all good.
Now, yeah, I would totally agree. I think that obviously the proof is becoming more and more and more of an obsession for people. However, the 12 is our biggest volume driver by a long way. And closely followed by the 16 in the Abuna. I think we can get really obsessed with proof, and I think that one thing that kind of bugs me about the industry is it's like we're getting into this, and I don't want to rag on the industry, but while I was getting my water earlier, I heard everybody talking about is it going to be a collectible or not? And I think that we have really, unfortunately, whiskey's gotten to the stage now where it has become this one-up game, where everybody's talking about how much they paid for their bottle, and it's not so much about the bargain anymore. It's about, oh well, I actually paid $20 more than you, so this bottle's worth more, or this bottle's got 0.3% higher in proof, or this bottle's from an even more expensive barrel, and so on and so forth. And I think it's so easy to get caught up in that. So I would say that for everybody here tonight, we've actually got 3 whiskies, two at 80 proof, and one's going to be at about 120, just under 120. If you guys are completely honest with yourself, you'll probably find that a big group of people here actually prefer the 12 or the 16 to the higher proof. And I'm actually in that as well. I'm someone that likes my whiskey between 40 and 48% by alcohol by volume. So that's 80 and 96, between 80 and 96 proof in American money in freedom units. Right. So, try your best whenever you're drinking whiskey to ask yourself one question at a time. Don't let someone dictate to you how good something's going to be before you've tried it. My biggest thing with whiskey drinkers is that we do get this, like I said before, the one-upping. Try your best to ask yourself one question at a time. Do I like this? Is this tasty? Yes. Okay. Is it sweet or is it bitter? Or is it sweet or is it sour? Is it sweet or is it dry? Oh, it's sweet. Okay, then what is the sweetness? Is it dark fruit or light fruit? And work your way through the whiskey that way. Try not to be overcome, try not to succumb to this sort of, my gun's bigger than your gun kind of thing.
It's funny you mentioned that because, I know that Brett Pontani from Binny's. He and I have known each other for years, and I remember early on he and I were talking about these private tastings that Binny has, And he told me that there's always this group of people who show up to the tastings who will buy the most expensive bottles that were sampled no matter what. Okay, they're like, and it's the same people. They always are going to buy the most expensive ones, and you know, and of course, you know, those are important people for the retailers. Okay, you know, but there's always people who are just going to go that way. But before we get off the 12 and the 16 here, very important. Our people want to know here about the grains. Okay, can you talk a little bit about the mash bill of the 12, the mash bill of the 16? You know, where the grains come from and the differences.
Yeah, brilliant. So that was actually going to be my second answer for Eric. You know, the mash bill. Can we talk about the mash bill sort of thing? So for everybody, ladies and gentlemen, Scotch, single malt Scotch is 100% malted barley. So hopefully everybody knows that. Now, if you don't know what malted barley smells like or tastes like, take your Aberlour 12, crack it open, okay, and literally just put it on your hand like it's aftershave, okay? Close it, and then rub your hands together, okay? Smell your hands and you'll get this lovely kind of rich, earthy sweetness to it. And that's malted barley. Now, the mash bill, to come back to Eric's question, I think that's a phenomenal question because obviously in American whiskey, that is like the be all and end all of all the questions, right? Like what makes up the mash bill? And, you know, I love that. But one of the beauties about single malt Scotch is that we never have to worry about that. One thing that we do have to worry about that, you know, I think is important to note is actually that you can use different types of different species of barley, right? Or different strains of barley, if you like. Now, I can't speak to a lot of other Scotches. However, I can say that Aberlour uses barley that's native to Speyside. It grows within 50 miles of the distillery. So none of the barley we use is outsourced. It's all from local farmers. And we use about a ratio of 3 parts to 1 part, or 75% to 25% of Propino to Concerto. And those are the strains. Now, what does that mean? You're probably thinking at home, you're like, I don't want to hear any concertos, Callum.
Actually, I got to tell you, we have people here who really geek out on this stuff, so it's okay to give a detailed answer.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, just because sometimes I get stuck on this and I see glaze over. So we test every single shipment of barley that comes in is actually tested, not by Graham Cruikshank, actually. It's actually tested by Alan Winchester, who is the master distiller at the Glenlivet. Now, Alan used to run Aberlour back in the glory days in the mid-2000s, early to mid-2000s. And Alan, he will actually taste it. Before it's sent off to be scientifically tested, he'll taste it, every shipment of barley that comes in. The Propino and the Concerto basically, depending on how sciencey you want to get, and I'm sure there's probably people that know a lot more about it than me, but that's going to differ. That's going to make a change in the levels of nitrogen that you get in the barley, and obviously the malting process is basically to create sugars, right? So malted barley, they say, is one of the best grains for, you know, a variation in flavor in whiskey, or variation in flavor in liquor in general. But I'm actually slowly but surely, much to my parents and my Scottish friends' chagrin, I've been falling in love with rye as well. So, but that's another story, you know. But yeah, so we 75% Propino, 25% Concerto, and that's the sort of the if you like, the strain bill of our 100% malted barley.
And do you malt your own barley, or are you bringing in malted barley?
So the barley is malted off-site for us at Aberlour. You know, there's not a lot of malting floors still around the whiskey world. I'm sure you guys have, you know, a lot of people fall in love with the romanticism of it. And I'm sure everybody does at some stage. And I've malted my own barley and things like that. And it is a beautiful process. However, when you do it when you outsource it, it's usually more reliable. It's usually a more reliable process. These companies often specialize in malting the barley. And it's the same thing with yeast as well. You know, we actually get our yeast from a place in Hull in England, or Hull, if anyone's from Hull or from England, you'll get that joke. But Hull is, they basically ship us up a yeast that's called liquid distiller's yeast that's mass produced. And it's very similar to what, you know, I suppose it would be a dumbed down version of what MGP have got going on in Indiana, where they can mass produce and they can make really, really good stuff because they're doing it day after day after day, right? But yeah, it's obviously a complicated process, but so there is something to it, that we outsource our yeast and we outsource the malting process, but we keep the barley local. I think that obviously says a lot about where you're sourcing your grains from.
Okay, great. So I have to tell you that there's somebody on here who was very excited about tonight's tasting, because Todd Coe a few years ago once told me that the Abuna is one of his all-time favorite whiskeys. He just loves the Abuna. And I know there are quite a few people here that really love the Abuna. I want to warn everybody, we're talking about a significant increase in ABV. We're going up almost 50%. We're going from 40 to close to 60. So please keep that in mind. And I'd like Callum for you to tell us now, what is the Abuna? What is it that makes it magical? Why do so many people love it?
So the Abuna is what I like to call Scotch's very first cult whiskey. I think that when Abuna was launched in 1997, it gained this cult following because people were interested in learning about something that was a little bit different, something that was a little bit outside of the norm. And when we talk about single malt Scotch, and when we talk about Scotch in general at the time, the Abuna was a little bit of an outlier because there wasn't a lot of cask strength out there. The majority of Scotch that was being consumed wasn't single malt; it was blends, and it still is to this day. But single malts weren't nearly as big as they are now. And to have a cask strength single malt Scotch was just a totally different experience. And Paul, to answer that question, I just saw it very, very briefly there. I will answer that. The batch numbers that you see, they only started putting the batch numbers on at number 7. So the batch 7 is the oldest one that you can get. However, there are some bottles kicking about out there that don't have a batch on them, and those are the pièces de résistance. They are the ones that are the oldest. Oh, so it must have been 6 then, William. It must have been 6 that they started. Send me a picture of that, William, as well when you get a second. I'd love it. I'd love to see it. I can't really see it from here, man. It's a tough one to see. But basically, they started this whiskey in 1997. The idea was that they wanted to create a whiskey that was in the shape and the form and the essence, if you like, of what whiskey was like in the 1800s. So there's a few things about this one. It's exclusively matured in Oloroso sherry barrels. There's no bourbon barrel influence. A lot of the whiskies that we drank in the 1800s, they only spent time in one type of barrel because they didn't start the whole mixing of barrels and things until much later. Then it's small batch. The whiskies back in the 1800s, they were never the same. Okay, you would just copy the process and hope to God that it came out okay. This is similar to that. It's not quite as gung ho, but every single batch is slightly different, and every batch does taste different. People get obsessed with this, and they're right to be. I think there's a lot of difference in flavor with the batches, especially
how old is this? So obviously it has no age statement, okay? Mm-hmm. And that there are obvious reasons for that. Can you tell us a little bit about on average when somebody's drinking Abuna, how old are the whiskeys that we're drinking?
I like to venture a guess that it's around about 15 years. But obviously, legally, the legal definition of that wouldn't be right because there could be an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old sherry barrel in there which would bring it down. However, a few years ago, and this is the reason I think this, a few years ago we did a 16-year-old sherry barrel and we did a 19-year-old sherry barrel. The 19-year-old sherry barrel was in California. If anyone's out there, it was I think it was under K&L that they were doing it. Or Bevmo or something like that. It was K&L actually. And they did a 19-year-old. It was about $3.50 a bottle, $3.30 a bottle. And I tasted that side by side with some of the Abunas, and it really didn't taste much older. It didn't have much more of that spice influence. It didn't have much more of that dark fruit influence. So I would probably give this any Abuna around about 15 and 18 years. Obviously, we can't officially say that. Because it's not, we don't know. It could have a 3-year-old whiskey in there for all we know, right?
Right, of course. So this was again the whiskey that goes in here were aged from day one in Oloroso sherry cask. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the Oloroso sherry cask exclusively matured. So obviously that's the reason. That's partly the reason that this one blows everybody's socks off. You know, it's very, very, very rare to get an exclusively Oloroso sherry matured. Now I see William saying all sherry matured there. It's not just sherry; it's Oloroso sherry, right? That's the key here, and I think a lot of people get lose that in the translation. You know, they say, oh, you know, I've tried the Macallan X or the Balvenie, whatever, the sherry, cask, blah, blah, blah. A lot of these are PX sherries. You sometimes get a Manzanilla, whatever it might be, but this is Oloroso. And for anyone that doesn't know Oloroso, Oloroso is a Spanish word which means pungent or fragrant. And the reason that it's called Oloroso is because the barrels that are used to mature the sherry are only filled about 2/3 of the way up. So if this was my barrel here, let's look at this bottle of water. I only fill it up to about here. And what then happens is a floor or a film is created on the top, and it makes the sherry mature faster. And the Oloroso idea came from when they first started producing it. They were like, wow, that's so strong. It smells so strongly. And you get these flavors of kind of tanned leather, dark chocolate, you know, cherries, that sort of thing, figs, raisins, dates. And it differs a lot from the PX, which is a lot lighter in that fortified wine flavor, that red dark flavor. So yeah, very, very interesting.
We're getting great comments. People are really loving this. Before I open it up for questions, I do have a few more questions just for you about Aberlower and your company. One word that we haven't really mentioned tonight is the word peat. Okay, peat. We haven't talked about smoked. Haven't talked about peat. Can you talk a little bit about your distillery's approach to using peat? Do you ever use it? Do you ever plan to use it? Well, what are your thoughts on that?
No peat.
Okay. There we go. Nice and easy. Quick,
no peat, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, look, right? Don't get me wrong. There have been some experiments in the past. But to be honest with you, look, the big guns, you know, your Bowmore, your Lagavulin, your Lefroy, Octomore, Talisker, Bruichladdich, whatever you want to say, whatever, you know, you can, there's Cowlila, there's countless of them. We don't need to venture into that world.
Okay,
you know?
Great. Another question that I have for you is, does any Aberlour show up in any blends?
Oh, who asked that? Great question.
That's me. That's me.
Nice one. No, not anymore. Up until the 1980s, there was Aberlour in a lot of the blends, a lot of the Chivas Brothers blends. However, those days are gone. All of the Aberlour that we produce is needed now. You know, we got to put it away. People have fallen in love with this. Is, you know, the Aber boom that I said before. It's just completely taken off, and we need it all now. Which is good and bad, because it would have been lovely to have. It would have been lovely to know that there's a Chivas Regal out there that, you know, specifically has an Aberlour. The closest that anyone got was actually Chivas Regal. They did the Chivas Regal Altus, which they launched in late 2016 in New York. And the Altus had Breval, Tormore, Altavania, Strathyla, and I can't remember the fifth one, but it had 5 malts in it, and they were all very close to Aberlour.
Interesting. That sounds like a fascinating blend, because your company. I mean, I went to the website, and so am I correct that the brands include Chivas, Jameson, Redbreast, Middleton, Glenlivet, Jefferson's, and TX, right? Those are all brands that are
and
part
Smooth
of your company,
Ambler, right? Smooth Ambler, Old Scout as well. Yeah, so there's some really, really, really great whiskies in that range. Obviously, the biggest one is Jameson. You know, massive volume driver, followed closely by, or I think Ballantyne's might actually sell more than Jameson. Longmorn. It's Longmorn. Someone said Longmorn. That was it. Yeah, Longmorn was the fifth whiskey there.
Myers is an incredible source of information. We have a few people like him on here, so we always appreciate his answers to stuff like that. It always helps. It's great.
Yeah.
But yeah, you got all these companies. Glenlivet. I mean, it's a lot of serious companies, and TX too.
Yeah, TX, obviously brilliant whiskey. Jefferson's was the one that I think really flew under the radar. You know, it's been one that I didn't realize how big Jefferson's was until I got to the United States. And then we purchased it, and next thing I knew, it was everywhere. People were talking about it all the time. You know, people have it at their weddings and things. So that one's obviously been excellent. It's done very, very well. However, I think the home or the big volume drivers are obviously the blended scotches. Between Ballantine's and Chivas Regal alone, they're running over 12.5 million cases.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, that's just
massive.
a huge amount.
It's absolutely massive. And then obviously, I don't know how far you dug in there, but there's obviously things like 100 Pipers, something special, that sell millions of cases as well. Just not in the United States. They're more of sort of Latin America and Asia focused.
Right, of course. So, let's see, Eric, do you have any particular questions for Callum before we open it up to everybody else?
One quick question. I know the Abuna is obviously much higher ABV than the rest of them, but since they are all batched together, are they all? Is it a cask strength, or are you proofing down the Abuna at all to meet some kind of flavor profile?
The Abuna's never proofed down.
Okay.
We basically will take a batch of, well, I'm not allowed to say how many barrels, but we'll take a batch of a lot of barrels, and we'll combine them together, and we will figure out where the flavor is that we want it to go. And oftentimes they'll go back to the batch before. So right now I think we're on batch 70. So when they make 71, they'll come to 70 and they'll say, okay, what was good about this one? But what do we want to change, And with the Abuna, I think it's so nuanced, right? Like, you've got to have a really, really good palate to get in there. I'm not the kind of person that can... there's an Aberlour Glenlivet from William. I love that, William. But I'm not the kind of person that will be able to really kind of key in on the flavors of the Abuna. However, there are people that tell me that they can taste them night and day, between the batches. So that's what they'll do. And then once they've combined all the barrels that they wanted, they'll taste it, they'll test it, they'll bottle it, and that'll be that. It's also non-chill filtered as well. I don't know if I mentioned that before, but that's obviously quite a big point of contention. A lot of people love that argument. I'm a big believer in non-chill filtration. I love talking about it, and it's something that I always come back to. But obviously, that's another thing as well that separates the Abuna from the 12, 16, and the 18 as well.
Great. Eric, do you have any other questions?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is I actually want to give the first question to Todd Coe, because Todd years ago told me just how much he just loved Abuna. It's one of it's really the dram that got him into Scotch, and he's one of my my best friends here in whiskey. And so Todd, if you could unmute yourself, because I think you have a question or two for Callum, and then everybody else, if you can start with the hand raising like Myers is already doing. So Todd, if you could ask your question, please.
Yeah, I have two questions because I've been on too many calls with Paul, and I go 2 to 1 here. So the first one, I think you may have spoken to already, but I had some audio problems, and that's the batch variation in the Abuna. Like, there have been some recent batches that were, I don't want to say disappointing, but not as knock your socks off as I remember. And I'm wondering what's driving the variation in the batches.
I mean, honestly, that's like saying, why did someone add peanut butter to their sandwiches or whatever? These things are just completely arbitrary decisions that are made by the higher ups. And I'm sorry that it's not more romantic. I'm sorry we don't go outside the warehouse and we ask the angels in the warehouse what we should do with the next batch of Abuna. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. With any whiskey, with any food, with any beverage, Todd, you're going to have people that disagree, right? One of my favorite ever batches was batch 67. And I think that I spoke to a lot of people and they were like, oh, this isn't for me. I'm falling out of love with the Abuna. And then batch 67 won 99 points at the IWSC, and Forbes.com called it the world's best whiskey, So I was like, oh, great, we're vindicated a little bit. But then batch 68, 69 came out, and I wasn't a big 68 fan. I was a big 69 fan, and I'm not a massive 70 fan, right? So I suppose it's just really your own sort of preference. Now, what drives that variation? Really, it's up to the arbitrage of the master blending team, which is led by Sandy Hislop. He also blends, he helps blend the Glenlivet, he helps blend Chivas Regal, Ballantine's, all this sort of stuff. So he generally knows what he's doing. or I say generally, but he definitely knows what he's doing. Hopefully, he doesn't watch this. Christ, I'll be fired in a second. He generally knows what he's doing, and we just kind of have to trust him, and hopefully, the next batch that comes out is a little bit more to your palate. I think the 70 was like 100, or the 69 was like 124 proof or 123 proof or something, so I think they're actually going back to that sort of heavier style, because there was a while when they came out and they were like 114, 115, 116, and I think people were disappointed. One people were like, God damn, 58%, man, I wanted 61 or whatever, so it's like, fair play, all right, fair play. So it's one that, it's a question that comes up all the time, man. Like, people are so interested in the Abuna. Like, there's definitely, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Abuna Collective. Have you heard of the Abuna Collective, Todd? Yeah, so the Abuna Collective obviously was something that we got kind of going a long time ago. And I think that, I don't want to say too much in case I have to claim that I got deep faked on the internet. But the Abuna Collective or something similar might be making a return soon, and maybe that'll actually give people a little bit more say in what's going into these bottles. Has he answered your question there?
Yeah,
because it was a long answer to a very challenging question, I must admit.
That's a great answer. And if I could just ask one more before I cede the floor, this is a little more esoteric question, but I'm really curious about the concept of provenance or terroir in whiskey. And these guys know that I always ask the question about this. But essentially, I want to know why is it that the same barley, same casks, same stills, somewhere else in the world couldn't make Aberlour as we know it? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Aberlour,
it does. It does. And I don't know. I mean, I do know, but it's a massive combination of all of those variables that you've mentioned already. Plus, people really underestimate the blending of or the marriage of casks of Aberlour, and I think of other distilleries in the region. One thing that I think that we lose in all this amazing, I love that, and I'm fascinated with single barrels, absolutely fascinated with them, right? But the reason that Aberlour is so famous and has done so well is because of the consistency that they're able to get time after time after time, batch after batch after batch. The reason that people struggle to make good whiskey elsewhere in the world and they start resorting to small batch stuff or single barrel stuff is because the consistency of making these whiskies is absolutely exhausting. And I think that, combined with the terroir, combined with the fact that Speyside has small cities of barrels where they're rotated through, and then you've got that lovely Highland spring air that carries all the pollen and all that sort of thing, the nutrients on the air, it's always very, very cool in the warehouse. And plus, obviously, the terroir of actually, cultivating the grains. And then there is and this is obviously not scientific at all, Todd, and I'm sorry that I'm going to resort to this, but maybe there is a little bit of magic there, man. And that's what I hold on to. That's actually genuinely what I hold on to. I hold on to that. There is a wee bit of magic there. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question, man. Sorry I couldn't be more scientific.
No, that's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Myers, then Nolan, then Eisenberg. Myers, please unmute.
Thanks. Just broke a cork on my Aberlour 15. Hey, so I was the I can't pronounce it correctly, but it means like rare cask. Are they still doing that or not?
Yeah, they're still doing the Cascanam or the Cascanaf, depending on the accent that you use with your Scots Gaelic.
What batch are they on?
I think they're on batch 4 or 5 now. I actually launched that in the United States in 2018.
Batch 1.
I mean, it's a lovely, lovely, lovely dram. That's 48%, so 96 proof. That is can't remember who asked the question. I think it was Eric, actually, was asking about the Abuna being proofed down. The Abuna isn't, but the Cascanam actually is. It comes out at cask strength and then it's proofed down to that 48%. Non-chill filtered as well, William, so you're going to get that lovely kind of mouthfeel to it.
But my favorite is the one that I bottled at the distillery.
Yes, so you can't do that anymore, actually.
Really?
You can't do that anymore. So it's funny, the other night, I was in Vegas. We did Whiskey X in Vegas, and this guy came up to me, and he was just enamored with Aberlour Scotch. Right? He was just like, I'm honestly surprised he didn't open his shirt and he had a tattoo of Graham's face, or like of Aberlour's logo on his chest. The guy was crazy about this stuff, but he was saying, "Oh man, I really want to go back, and I want to make my own bottle. I want to pour my own bottle." And I had to break it to them that we don't do that anymore. But it was definitely a great experience, and I'm glad that you've got that bottle, man.
Why don't they do it anymore?
To be honest, man, probably something to do.
That's the one that I wrote about in the Michael Jackson book. It's
probably I don't know. I don't know why they don't do it anymore. I presume because of the amount of visitors that they get now. Everybody in their dog would want to be doing that
now. Very nice. All right, Nolan, please unmute.
Yeah, I feel like Paul. I got a number of questions, but I've got one that probably would interest everyone. Do you know the Abuna creation story? Can you tell it to everyone?
Do you want my interpretation of the story, or do you want the story that they tell everybody?
So like your story with interpretive dance.
A real one.
Real story. So the story goes, God, I hate telling the story. I genuinely do. The story goes that when Pernod Ricard purchased the Aberlour distillery in the 1970s, I think it was 1974, they renovated the distillery. They wanted to add stills. They wanted to add, new infrastructure to the distillery, easier to come in and go with lorries and things like that. And the story goes is that they found a time capsule with a newspaper and a bottle of Aberlour. And the time capsule had obviously been built just after they'd rebuilt the distillery after the fire in the late 1890s. 1898, there was a huge fire at the distillery. And so basically, Eric's distracting me with these questions. Basically, they say that they drank the bottle of whiskey that they found, and it was an exclusive. It was like they say that it just was a huge sherry bomb, and they say the workmen drank half of it, and they gave the other half to the lab to be analysed and to be looked at, and that's why 25 years later, they got or 24 years later, they got the Aberlour Abuna. I would say, I don't know if that's the story that you were asking for, Nolan, but I would say take that with a pinch of salt, man. Whiskey, Scotch whiskey, American whiskey, Irish whiskey, it's full of myths, legends, and all the rest of it. And sometimes people can get a little bit ahead of themselves. However, one thing that I will say to you is that they do have the newspaper article and an old bottle from the late 1890s at the distillery, well, in the Chivas Brothers archive. So there is, oh, that's my bottle of water shouting at me. There is some truth to it, but I'm not sure how much it was analysed and all this sort of stuff. So pinch of salt, man, pinch of salt.
I think that's a great story, though. I mean, yeah, it's a story, but it's imaginative and I think brings people in. And I always enjoyed that story.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a fantastic story, and I think they tell it in every tour at Aberlour, so take it as you will, man. I'm the kind of person, I try my best to speak facts only when I'm talking about whiskey, because I know how these stories can grow legs, can grow arms and legs, there's so many different stories out there. And a few weeks ago I was in New York, and I won't name names, but one of Macallan's employees said that to a group full of people, a group full of press, said that Macallan owns 90% of the sherry barrels in the beverage industry. And I was like, see, these are the kind of things that grow arms and legs, right? And I think that while that was obviously a small exaggeration, I try not to do that with whiskey stories. Like, I try not to do that. They found this bottle in the distillery, and they reverse engineered it and so on. So
awesome. Let's see. Josh Eisenberg.
This has been great. Really enjoyed it. Callum, question for you about the blending process with the spirit that's been aged in the bourbon barrels and the spirit that's been aged in the sherry casks. As bourbon has become more popular. Obviously, Aberlour has been around for a very long time. Can you talk a little bit about the relationships that you have with the cask source, right? How that's needed to shift to maintain the consistency. I'd love a little bit, more about that.
Yeah, very astute question, and it's not a coincidence, to say the least, that Pernod Ricard is being on the lookout for more bourbon brands, to say the very least, Josh. One other thing that I would say, though, whenever you talk about ex-American barrels, right? So Quercus Alba, but it hasn't necessarily had bourbon in it, okay? The biggest two producers are Jim and Jack, right? So 90% of the Scotch that has ex or first fill American oak or second fill American oak or ex-American oak on it, that, if you had to gamble your life on it, it's probably Jack or Jim or Jack, whichever one you prefer. All right. However, one thing that you'll notice with the Abuna, and Nolan held up a bottle of the Abuna. I can't find him now, but he was holding up a bottle of the Abuna earlier. It says ex-bourbon on it. There you go, matured in bourbon oak barrels. It says on there. Now that legally binds us to using ex-bourbon barrels, and that massively reduces the market for us. When you talk about ex-American barrels and ex-bourbon barrels, the difference is about 5x. If you buy an ex-American barrel, say it costs you, it's not the exact, but say it costs you $100, ex-bourbon barrel costs you about $400 or $500. Because they're fewer and further between, And Susan, not a problem, pal. Thank you so much for joining. So that would be something that I would say that Pernod is envisioned, and that's why I don't think it's a coincidence that we're starting to see all of these different brands popping up in Pernod's portfolio, as Gil mentioned before.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem, man. My pleasure.
Okay, so then let's see. We're getting close to the end here. We have Paul and then Ariel. So Paul.
Good evening.
Oh, no.
So we were talking about blending and the art of blending being penultimately important in, the taste and flavor and developing a really good whiskey and not getting the credit that it deserves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it occurs to me that blending really only matters when you're not using all of the whiskey, i.e. when you set some things aside because they don't make the cut and they don't make the blend. So how much would you say that, given that you guys aren't selling any or getting rid of any of this at this point because you need so much of your own, how many barrels would you say on a percentage basis don't make muster for that as you're doing the blending?
So
and what happens to that poor whiskey?
Well, I think what often happens is that that whiskey is just put back into mature, unless it's off, unless it tastes bad or poor or whatever. Unless something's happened to it, there's a specific high content of something, and it will be tested as well. Or if it just doesn't taste right, if it doesn't taste right, it's probably going to be dumped, unfortunately. Or maybe that stuff will be sold to blends. But the majority of the time, if there's a barrel that isn't quite right, Graham will test these barrels every 3, 4, 5 months, sometimes 6 months, depending on the barrel, depending on how old it is, depending on how long it's been there and the quality of the cut and everything. But 9 times out of 10, if it doesn't taste right, it's going back into the barrel. I'm sure that in the avoidance of waste, that if it is an 8-year-old whiskey and Graham or Sandy or whoever's doing the blending at that stage isn't keen on it, they're like, I'm not up for this. I don't want this going into an Abuna, or I don't want this to age for another 4 years and go into a 12-year-old double cask. Then they'll probably sell it off to one of the other brand homes. But one thing, again, coming back to how cheap Scots are, we're not the kind of people that like throwing stuff away. And, we've been using ex-bourbon barrels or ex-American barrels. I think I was reading up on this the other day, the first sort of real noticeable export, or rather importation of American wood is in 1756. and there was 1.75 million staves sent from New Orleans to London for whiskey maturation. And so we've been doing it for 250 years, man. So it's not often, I think, that they have to throw a lot of stuff away. Obviously, there's accidents, barrels, wood goes off. You know, sometimes you lose some barrels, wherever. But more or less, you know, we don't waste a lot of the whiskey, fortunately, for all of us.
So then would you say that like there's re-racking that occurs into barrels that are better, because a lot of the time if the whiskey doesn't pass muster, that it's often the fault or the issue with the barrel itself?
So yeah, if a barrel, say 9 times out of 10, if a barrel produces poor whiskey, or if the whiskey just isn't right, sometimes the whiskey will actually just be changed over the barrel, and the barrel will be broken down and used either that they'll divide the staves up and use it in a third fill for a blend somewhere, which is quite common practice, or it'll be recycled. You know, the wood will be recycled. One thing I would say is that, you know, the more and more you get into wood management, the more you're going to see that sort of you know, the changing of the staves, if you like. People move, you know, this barrel obviously wasn't pieced together right. It goes into the pile, the staves are separated, and then they're put into other barrels to be used properly there.
Great. Awesome.
Changing
Thank
of the
you.
staves. That sounds like a great intro.
Yeah,
next question. No,
that came off my tongue, and I was like, "Oh God, I'm going to get ripped for that."
But that could also like be the name of a band. I mean, that like a bad Scottish garage band. That'd be great.
Isn't that Joshua Hatton's next band?
Very good. All right, so we're going to finish it up with a question from Ariel Eisenberg.
Wow, great to be at the tail end there. So you were mentioning first, second fill, X bourbon. Obviously, the first and second fill is pretty self-explanatory, but what makes a cask an X cask as opposed to a first or a second fill cask?
Great question, and it's all in the wording. So first fill in Scotch is generally, first fill American in Scotch is generally second fill overall in that cask's life. But if you know, occasionally you get first fill sherry, which means that it's the first fill after the sherry was in there as well. If Scotch, however, uses virgin oak, if it says virgin American oak cask or cask matured, then that means that it's the very first fill in that barrel's lifetime. Honestly, though, mate, and this is something that I don't know if a lot of brand ambassadors would be 100% honest about. Scotch doesn't really use virgin oak, and there's several reasons for it. Number one, and the most important one, is that virgin oak has an extremely powerful flavor, and that's why we drink a lot of bourbons, a lot of ryes, even though they're 6 months, a year and a half old, whether it's bottled and bond, even bottled and bond, or whatever it is. As you get up that age range, a lot of it's just you get this wood kind of flavor, right? This wood oaky flavor to it. And Scotch, as a rule, you can't call something a Scotch if it's only been matured for 2 years or 2.5 years. It doesn't count. It has to be a minimum of 3 years. And so what ends up happening is that a lot of these Scotches come out, they don't have that powerful sweetness that a corn might have, that a corn grain whiskey might have, a bourbon or a rye. And the malted barley is a little bit softer. And so the oak completely overpowers it. So the only thing that I think that you sometimes do see is things like a virgin American oak finish, which has produced some really, really, really lovely whiskies. Dalmore, we're big into that for a long time in the mid to late 2000s. Balvenie have experimented with that, and then they ended up settling on the Caribbean cask. I don't know if anyone's had that 14-year-old, but that was a sort of an experimentation that they went through. And then I know that Buchanan's, curiously, the blend from Diageo, they started doing that as well, but then they pivoted to go with tequila barrels instead. So that's probably one of the main differences, and hopefully that has answered a little bit of the question of what is a virgin oak barrel, first fill, second fill, third fill, so on and so forth.
Well, it was more about what makes an X barrel as opposed to a second.
If it's had something in it before. If it's had something in it before. So if it's ex-bourbon, it's had bourbon. If it's ex-Oloroso, it's had Oloroso sherry.
Cool.
But
thank you.
Perfect.
Like I said before, sorry, Gil. Let me finish this.
Please.
Me, because people do get bogged down in this. So if someone says it's an ex-American barrel, an ex-American oak barrel, that means that it's had American whiskey in it. Okay, but if someone says in Scotch that it's first fill if it's virgin American oak, then it hasn't had any whiskey in it. It's Quercus alba. It's come off the lumber mill and made it into a barrel, and they're going to put Scotch in it. And the same goes for Quercus robur, Quercus petraea, which is from England/Ireland, depending on who you want to fight. And then even some Hungarian oak that we were talking about earlier.
But even a virgin would still have a char of some type.
Yeah. There's very, very, very few liquors in general that don't char the barrels. Especially with Scotch, I'm a big believer in the char as well. There are some people that think that we should go back to not charring them, but that's a very, very small minority of the Scotch community.
Got it. These have been great questions and incredibly comprehensive answers. So what I'd like everybody to do right now is I'd like everybody, if you are so inclined, to pour yourself another dram. I'm going back to the Abuna. Evan can't go back to the Abuna because he's already finished his Abuna, which is rather impressive given the quantity that you gave us. And if everybody could please unmute. And everybody, if you can please say cheers and thank you to Callum O'Donnell, Aberlower.
Cheers. Thank you so much. This was outstanding.
This is amazing. Callum, before we finish it up here, I do want to say, on the record here, please thank Carly, okay, with your company, because everybody here needs to know that because of our relationship with Callum and our reputation, we were able to get 2.5 times as many samples as they usually give out. Okay, they usually keep these to 12 people, and I said our people show up, and and the fact is you did. We had over 30 people on this tonight. They sent out 30 samples. This was great. So awesome. Really, Callum, thank Carly for us, please. Because she really came through and you came through. And do you have any final words for us before we turn off the recording?
No, just listen, guys. I've obviously talked a lot about Aberlour, but at the end of the day, it comes back to what I said at the beginning. Whenever you drink whiskey, whenever you drink anything, there's only one question that you should be asking yourself, and is it, do I like this? And if it's yes, then keep buying it, keep supporting it, keep drinking it. Otherwise, don't get bogged down in the other crap. Don't worry too much about the romance. Don't worry too much about the stories that you hear and the gossip that you hear. Try to just keep it simple for yourself, because that's the reason that the Scots and the English and the Irish fell in love with whiskey in the first place, because they kept it simple and they were like, "Damn, this stuff is good." So, here's to misbehaving tonight, ladies and gentlemen.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Behaving and Mr. Behaving.
Yes. Eric, please